Now Magnus is in green, and he wants to win that green by taking down Hikaru Nakamura in this final.
That's hilarious. It reminds me of those, those psychology studies where they show that you're actually not attentive to change at all. I'm impressed you noticed that, but I was like, green? Magnus Carlsen? We definitely didn't see that before. Am I crazy? We have seen Berlins before in the chess career of Hikaru Nakamura, haven't we?
We certainly have. We see A4 played by Magnus, and Hikaru looks to the side. He's like, what is Magnus aiming for? What is my preparation? And let's not confuse the matter. Both of these players prepare. And maybe they don't prepare it right before the match for this specific game, but they are so well prepared throughout their careers that when Magnus plays some sideline, Hikaru says, yeah, I've seen this one before.
They're locked and they're loaded and they review their lines constantly. And this move A to A4, it might strike you as puzzling. It was the recommendation of opening specialist Grandmaster Darius Schwirch in a recent book that he wrote on the Ruy Lopez. This is what he recommended against the Berlin. And the idea is to keep this bishop on B5 for the time being. Now, eventually, it often slides back to F1 anyway, and then the pawn advances to A5, just kind of clamping down on the queen side. But look at this. Look at this from Magnus. He goes D4, sacrificing the pawn. And Hikaru says, no, I want the Berlin. I want the structure.
He gives the pawn back on E4, and that's what great players do. They don't get materialistic. They say, I will give you that pawn back, but I will get time and activity. He played D5 with tempo against the rook on E4. The rook slides back. Now the light square bishop can get out from C8 and go to G4 as you're indicating. So one big thing that Magnus and Hikaru need to figure out is bishop takes C6 a threat.
You're reading my mind. It's crazy.
Pawn structure, and the knight is trying to come into E5 to follow. So bishop G4 at least eliminates the knight E5 follow-up, and that's why Hikaru played bishop G4 with the pin.
And Magnus delaying for the time being. He procrastinates on the decision, but he improves his position nonetheless. The move C3 is necessary. It takes the sting out of bishop takes F3. Will he take on C6 now? Something tells me he'd rather keep his bishop on the board, but who knows?
He can also play the move A5 right now, and there's a reason why. If black responds to A5 with the pawn push A6, now it is time to take on C6. So if we can actually bring up an analysis board and show that, I think it's very instructive that what white wants to accomplish in inducing the move A6 is to get a clamp on the dark squares. B4, no C5 pawn push for you. And once you establish this control of the dark squares, yes, right now the eval bar says that black is better, but in the long term, black is stuck with these pawn weaknesses in place.
You're absolutely right. I think this is a great line, and this shows that there is a lot at stake here. Well, there's $20,000 at stake and an SEC title, but in this particular position, what's at stake is the future of black's queenside. This is an idea Hikaru has to take seriously, and after A5, he might decide to drop the knight back to E7. Maybe this is part of the reason he put his bishop on D6. But first, Magnus takes a rain check on that and asks politely, or not so politely, whether Hikaru wants to stay on this diagonal. And I think he does.
Well, if he wants to play bishop h5, he has to be ready for the move g2 to g4. We often tell our students, don't push pawns in front of your king. It makes your king weaker, less safe, but sometimes you want to break a pin. It's that important. So g4 is a possibility in some positions with knight e5 galloping into the center. So right now, Hikaru plays bishop f5. He drops it back. Knight e5 still a possibility here for Magnus.
It is indeed, as is bishop b5 to d3 if you really want to bail out. But if you want to fight for the advantage here, I think you need to introduce some form of imbalance. Robert, I don't think you're beating Hikaru with a pawn structure as it currently stands. Bishop takes c6 and knight e5 looks pretty tempting, and it's funny that Hikaru is actually provoking this. I think he's doing that consciously. I think he senses that Magnus isn't quite as comfortable as he normally is taking these kinds of positional risks, and he's inviting it and taking the Hess approach. Is there knight a5 and c6, though?
Wow, that's a big tactical shot. And if it's available, that would be huge for Hikaru. And he's going to look at it. I mean, he's looking quizzically at the board. He plays a6.
He missed
that's
it.
A big opportunity for Magnus. Hikaru doesn't see that little tactical shot here. And now, Danya, bishop c6 and pawn b4, it looks like you get the clamp that's desired on the queen side.
That was a fantastic call, and you get an even better version of it because the knight is now free to jump into e5 when necessary, supplementing the potential move queen a4. And that pawn on c6 is going to be under fire from all angles.
Right. And so Magnus hasn't moved yet. He might play your bishop d3, just try to gain space on the queen side first, then trade bishops. But I like bishop takes c6 with knight e5 or b4 first. The point is that you are just getting the activity that you desire. There is no pin on that knight any longer.
And correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't seem like bishop takes c6 is that much of a risk. Yes, you're giving up the bishop pair. Yes, in the future, you might have to consider some sacks on h3 and you have to watch for the safety of your king. But it's not like bishop takes c6 burns any bridges, and Magnus doesn't want to burn any bridges at all. Is he playing a little bit too conservatively? Not to criticize the world champion, of course, but I think you kind of get what I'm saying here, Robert.
Of course, I get what you're saying. I think that he is just a little bit sloppy in the early stages. He'd be the first to say that. That's not undue criticism. And for Hikaru, when he's been making mistakes, it feels like they're not as consequential. I mean, that game where Magnus won a pawn, he had some great chances, but he just couldn't make the most of it. And Hikaru, on the other hand, he won a game on time. That was big. It was a must. And then he won another game by stealing a couple pawns and converting it with precision. So queen d7. Is bishop takes h3 a threat? Magnus didn't want to find out, so he takes his knight h4, and he's going to play queen g4 and try to get that knight into f5.
And this is the kind of chess that we are accustomed to see from Magnus Carlsen, tightening the screws, playing on both sides of the board. And he moves the queen up, not to g4, but one square behind on f3. You're not threatening queen takes d5. Don't blunder bishop h2. But what you are threatening is knight h4 to f5. And that is why Hikaru engineers pressure on the e-file to distract white's attention away from the f5 square and force white to address the subtle threat, Robert, of rook takes e1 checkmate.
Well, a5 is a weakness. That's a big point here. Bishop d2, rook takes e1. You'd love to take back with your rook on e1, get the open file, but a5 falls. You cannot afford to lose that pawn because not only is it a pawn, but the knight will sink its teeth into those light squares on the queen side. So big choice for Magnus. He played bishop e3, blocking the rook's access in the e-file, but you're also blocking your own rook on e1, and that just doesn't feel very pleasant. The black rook can slide up to e4, and suddenly it's Hikaru who has all the fun in the position.
Well, you like to observe when offense changes into defense, and I think we're seeing, and vice versa, we're seeing that here. Magnus drove that pawn up to a5. It was unequivocally a strength. You were grabbing space on the queen side. All of a sudden, it's turned into perhaps white's biggest weakness, and I think we are going to see Hikaru taking on e1. And is Magnus going to recapture with the bishop here? No, he's going to sack the pawn.
Wow.
And I think he's going to make a serious play for quick kingside attack based on knight h4 to f5.
And Hikaru is like, ooh, I didn't necessarily take this as seriously as I could have, because he thought knight takes a5 was a pawn, but knight f5 and queen g4 is the big threat there. Some people may think you're just trying to take this bishop on d6. No. You're threatening checkmate on g7 and a discovery. When pieces are on the same line as each other, in this case, a queen on g4 and a queen on d7, you have to think what happens when the piece in between gets out the way. So g6 play to stop knight f5. Magnus can play pawn to b4 here, Danya. That's available. And he just says, I've gained all the space on the queen side, and now I don't have to worry about losing that pawn.
And another wise decision by Hikaru that's easy to gloss over. He says, I'm avoiding knight takes a5 with a 10-foot pull. But not only that, he didn't take 90 seconds to make that decision. He keeps his edge on the clock. You're surprised by the move g3.
Well, d5 is now can be captured. Before it could not, because the bishop h2 check with a discovery. So h3 can be captured, a5 can be captured, but no matter which pawn black takes, everything can be captured, but d5 will fall. That's such an important pawn in black's position. It frees up the rest of the white pieces. So a big move there from Magnus, good recognition, and Hikaru needs to find a move. Does he just defend the pawn on d5 with knight to e7? But that allows the bishop from d2 to go into h6, the queen to go to f6, and watch out for checkmate.
And that's because the move g6, it wasn't all peaches and cream. Yes, you stop knight f5. You stop one thing, you close some doors, you open others. And after bishop h6 and queen f6, the door to the 2-point lead is going to be closed for Hikaru. So he's got to do something about this, and he's got to defend d5 at the same time. He's got a lot on his to-do list here, Robert. Maybe bishop back to e7 should be considered, but that is a little bit passive, and I think Hikaru's hesitating to basically hand the initiative over to Carlsen. There's also this knight maneuver to f4. So just because you defend the pawn once doesn't mean you're going to keep it alive forever.
And one thing about b4, which has finally been played, is if the queens are off the board, black will play b6. And if we get a swap on b6, black gets an outside pass pawn. So keep that in mind, that a queen trade could be very, very bad for white with rooks and pieces on the board. So right now, Magnus has no interest in trading queens. How Hikaru does that is a great question. And your idea, knight h4 to g2 to f4, that goes right after the d5 pawn, centralize the knight, and then I can use the h pawn as a battering ram.
Hikaru's shaking his head. He knows that these are exactly the kinds of positions that we are accustomed to see Magnus winning well over 50% of the time. We're also accustomed to see Hikaru defending them well over 50% of the time. Who's going to prevail as Magnus continues to tighten the screws, but Hikaru defends with c6, and that's a big move because finally the pressure has been taken off the pawn, and Hikaru can focus on protecting his king side.
There's the move queen f6 here threatens rook takes e7, but I think black doesn't have rook because of queen e5. You just get a pin everywhere. But Magnus making Magnus moves. King g2, small
and Hikaru,
incremental progress, but Hikaru's jumping in.
He's making Hikaru moves, and he's also forcing Magnus to make a move. Who's down to 17 seconds, reshuffling, rerouting. But here comes Hikaru's knight, sinking its teeth into e4. I think Hikaru's getting the upper hand here.
Well, now he allowed knight e5 with tempo, so he didn't bring the knight to e4. And wow, he trades rooks.
Now he's going to go knight e4. No, he's just going to trade everything. Queen e4 here forces the queen trade.
That's bad news for Magnus, who's in time trouble. If he takes the queen, knight takes back, and the c3 pawn is loose.
Oh my goodness.
Queen. Oh gosh, I thought he's hung a piece, but the knight is under attack.
Knight e8 almost wins the game. White has to cling to the bishop. Hikaru down to 8 seconds. He's played it. Where's the queen going? Back to f4?
Wow, goes back to f4. Bishop h6, trade, and then bring the knight in. He wants a repetition.
I don't think he minds a repetition. He's up 2 points in the match. No need to do anything crazy. But we know Hikaru. He's thinking about it.
Yeah, 3 seconds. I think he just repeats.